Outlines of Theosophy by I. Taylo. Published in 1908. To the mentally lazy or to the obtuse, Theosophy must remain a riddle, because no writer is prepared to do his readers' thinking for him, but as it is becoming every day more and more obviously the duty of those who have studied it to set forth its tenets to intelligent thinkers who have not yet done so, the following explanations are offered to those who are ready to receive them. Theosophy is not a religion but a philosophy, at once religious and scientific, and may be described as the science of the mystery of Christ, or divine wisdom, which its name signifies. The term is many thousand years old and comes to us from a school of philosophy founded by Amoius Saccas of Alexandria, and known as the Neoplatonists or Philaletheas, the latter name meaning lovers of truth. These Alexandrian philosophers, who were called by various other names, were the Theosophists of the early centuries, and the object of the system was then, as now, to impress upon the minds of its disciples and others certain great moral truths and to reconcile all religions, sects, and nations under a common system of ethics based on eternal verities. For Theosophy teaches us that, whatever pains a man may be at to draw lines of demarcation between his own particular creed and those of his brother Christians of other denominations, every Christian religion and every creed sprang from the trunk of the one root religion of the ancients. Therefore the world's religions, no matter what we elect to call them, are all based upon one and the same truth, although both nations and individuals view this truth only from their own particular standpoints in the world's spiritual evolution. Every ancient religion, or rather philosophical cult, consisted of an esoteric or secret teaching and an exoteric or outward form of public worship, and the mysteries of the ancients comprised with every nation the greater or secret and lesser or public mysteries. The priests of the ancient nations never imparted their real philosophical secrets to the masses, but allotted them only the husks. Northern Buddhism also has its esoteric and its exoteric schools, nor can anyone blame them for such secrecy, for who would feed a flock of sheep on learned dissertations on botany instead of on grass, or, in other words, cast pearls before swine? Pythagoras called his gnosis the knowledge of things that are, and preserved that knowledge only for his pledged disciples, who could digest and feel satisfied with such mental food, and whom he pledged to silence and secrecy, and the biographers of Amoius Saccas tell us that he bound his pupils by oath not to divulge his higher doctrines except to those who had already been instructed in preliminary knowledge, and who were also bound by a pledge. Finally we find the same secrecy observed in early Christianity among the Gnostics, and even in the teachings of Christ, who invariably spoke to the multitudes in parables, having a twofold meaning, explaining his reasons only to his disciples. Unto you, he says, it is given to know the mystery of the kingdom of God, but unto them that are without, all these things are done in parables. We see then that from the earliest ages there has always been both a spiritual interpretation of divine truth for those who have ears to hear and a dead letter rendering or external covering of the same for those who have not. But this does not imply that those who have not ears to hear never will have them. It simply means that they are what Theosophists call younger souls, who, not having evolved to the point of ability to receive spiritual truths, must take their religion in the only form suited to their mental capacity. The teachings of Theosophy are far more complicated and metaphysical than either spiritualism or current religious thought, and he is wise who gradually secures his neighbor's interest in them by his own exemplification of their virtues before attempting elaborate explanations of a science so abstruse and difficult of assimilation by minds which have been trained in Western thought. Therefore, after stating here, as briefly and as simply as possible, just a little of what Theosophy is and also a little of what it is not, I propose to call your attention to some points of difference between it and the doctrines of modern Christianity as preached in our churches of today, and to ask you, at your leisure, to judge between the two. Let us, however, begin by understanding the difference between abstract theosophy and the Theosophical Society by carefully noting that while the former is the reflection of divine wisdom, love and purity on earth, the latter, as a body, is but human nature striving to ascend to its original source, for, understanding that God is spirit and can therefore only reflect himself through the purest human temples, every true theosophist strives daily and hourly so to purify himself as to be able to meet and reflect more or less, according to the measure of his own effort, of this divine essence of love and purity which is always descending over all humanity but is retained only by those who are ready to receive it. Theosophy is preeminently a doctrine of self-sacrifice, and it warns its followers to rely for their spiritual, and also physical, well-being upon deeds rather than creeds, for a man's creed is serviceable only in so far as it leads him on to a common ground of purity and truth whereon the brotherhood of man, which Jesus taught, may become less impracticable than it is now, but his deeds, as also his words and thoughts, are all so much stock in trade which he is perfectly at liberty to use, both to his own and his neighbor's advantage or, alack, disadvantage according to his own good or evil desires, and, as selfishness with the human family has become almost a fine art, it requires but little reflection to arrive at the conclusions that, until man can be given a more practical reason than modern theology offers as to why he is his own enemy if he intentionally wrongs his neighbor or in any other way places himself in opposition to the laws of nature, until it can be brought home to him that, apart from all sentiment, there is a scientific, fundamental law underlying the principle of divine justice, until, in short, he can understand and appreciate the purpose of his being, there can be no such thing as true brotherhood amongst us. Theosophists are respecters of all religions and have a profound admiration for the religious ethics of Jesus, whose teachings, which have come down to us, are the same as those of Theosophy, and so far, therefore, as modern Christianity makes good its claim to be the practical religion taught by Jesus, Theosophists are with it hand and heart, but so far as it goes contrary to those ethics, pure and simple, Theosophists are its opponents. The comparison between the teachings of Jesus and the doctrines of the Church has frequently been made, and often with great learning and critical acumen, both by those who would abolish Christianity and those who would reform it, and the aggregate result of these comparisons goes to prove that, in almost every point, the doctrines of the Church and the practices of Christians are in direct opposition to the teachings of Jesus. The Theosophical Society has branches respectively composed of Buddhists, Hindus, Mohammedans, Parsis, Christians and freethinkers, who work together as brethren on the common ground of theosophy, because the deeper one penetrates into the meaning of the dogmas and ceremonies of all religions, the greater becomes their apparent underlying similarity, until finally a perception of their fundamental unity is reached, and this unity is theosophy, the secret doctrine of the ages which, diluted and disguised to suit the capacity of the multitude and the requirements of the time, has formed the living kernel of all religions. Therefore, Theosophists are accustomed to say to the Buddhist, the Mohammedan, the Hindu, or the Parsi, the road to theosophy lies, for you, through your own religion, because these creeds possess a deeply philosophical and esoteric meaning explaining the allegories under which they are presented to the people, but the same thing cannot be said to Christians, because the successors of the apostles never recorded the secret doctrine of Jesus, the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven which it was given to them, his apostles, alone to know. These have been suppressed, destroyed, and the stream of time has only brought down the maxims, the parables, the allegories and the fables which Jesus expressly intended for the spiritually deaf and blind to be revealed later to the world, and which modern Christianity either takes literally or interprets according to the fancies of the fathers of the secular church. In both cases they are like flowers severed from the plant on which they grew. Were Theosophists, therefore, to encourage Christians, as they do the votaries of other creeds, to study their own religion for themselves. The consequences would be, not a knowledge of the meaning of its mysteries, but either a revival of medieval superstition and intolerance, accompanied by a formidable outbreak of mere lip prayer and preaching, or else a great increase of skepticism. For Christianity has no esoteric foundation known to those who profess it. Even the highest dignitary of the Church must be only too painfully aware that he knows absolutely no more of those mysteries of the kingdom of heaven which Jesus taught his disciples than does the most illiterate member of his congregation. The Christian religion as it now exists is composed of the husks of Judaism, the parings of paganism and the ill-digested remains of Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, which curious conglomerate has gradually formed itself round the recorded sayings of Jesus, and which now, after the lapse of ages, has begun to disintegrate and fall away from the precious gems of theosophic truth which it has so long overlaid but could not destroy. To rescue these precious gems from the fate which threatens the rubbish requires a knowledge of the secret doctrine as it exists in the esoteric foundation of other religions. And this knowledge is not in the hands of the clergy, for the Church has hidden, and since lost, the keys. So you see, in plain language, it amounts to this, that those Christians of other denominations whom we denounce as heathens possess a far deeper knowledge of the mystery of Christ than does the Orthodox Church, and if so-called Christian missionaries would stoop to examine the tenets of other religions before they condemn them, they might save the often valuable though misguided lives which are now so constantly sacrificed to man's over-anxiety to train his neighbor before he has trained himself. We all know that Christians in their lives often rise above the level of their Christianity, and that churches contain many noble and virtuous men and women anxious to do good in their generation according to their lights and opportunities, full of aspirations to higher things than those of earth, in short, followers of Jesus in spite of their Christianity, and for these theosophists feel the deepest sympathy, for only a theosophist, or a person of delicate sensibility and great theological learning, can justly appreciate the tremendous difficulties with which the tender plant of natural piety has to contend as it forces its root into the uncongenial soil of Christian civilization and tries to blossom in the cold and cheerless atmosphere of theology. Yet how rarely does it strike Christians that God and Spirit could possibly exist in any other form than that under which they are presented in the doctrines of their church. Theosophy teaches men to be just, kind and true, because justice, kindness and truth are all attributes of divinity, and man is intended to be the reflection of divinity in the physical world. Divine principles lie dormant in every one of us, and our purpose here is to cultivate them into practical action for the advancement alike of our own and our neighbor's spiritual evolution and final restoration to that divine source whence we have all come, and to which all that is best and purest about us must return, not necessarily because the Bible says so, but because it is an immutable law of nature that like shall attract like, and consequently all that is divine in human nature must gradually rise towards, and finally mingle with, its parent source just as naturally as all that is of the earth must remain tied to earth. The churches, however, have never taught men any other or higher reason why they should be just, kind and true than the hope of reward and the fear of punishment. Thus while Theosophy urges man towards moral living by showing him that salvation comes of individual effort, the Church cuts the very ground of spiritual progression from beneath his feet by teaching the doctrine of his natural depravity. Yet it claims that Christianity is the only true religion, and the evil consequences of this teaching are terrible. Because when people discard dogma they fancy that they have discarded the religious sentiment also, and conclude that religion is a superfluity in life, a waste of energy which could be more profitably expended in the struggle for existence. The materialism of this age is therefore the direct consequence of the Christian doctrine that there is no ruling power in the universe, and no immortal spirit in man except those made known in Christian dogmas. For when men let go their belief in divine caprice and divine injustice as represented by Orthodox Christianity, the foundations of their morality are sapped and self-interest becomes the only motive for conduct, the fear of being found out the only deterrent from vice. If the energy evinced in building churches were a measure of religion, this would be a pious age indeed, for never was dogma better housed, though human beings may have to sleep by thousands in the streets, and these churches are all built in the name of him who had not where to lay his head, of him who tells us that religion is within us, not in temples made with hands. The churches do not recognize the quickly growing germ of the Christ spirit in the hearts of thousands whom they brand as infidels and madmen, yet amongst these there is the same spirit of love, of self-sacrifice, of immense pity for the ignorance, the folly and the sufferings of the world, which appeared in its purity in the heart of Jesus as it had appeared in the hearts of other holy reformers in other ages, and which is the light of all true religion, the light by which Theosophists of all times have endeavored to guide their steps along the narrow path that leads to salvation. A community must have a religion, that is to say, a uniting bond under penalty of social decay and material annihilation, and a religion is true in proportion as it supplies the spiritual, moral and intellectual needs of the time, and helps the development of mankind in these respects, but false in proportion as it hinders that development and offends the spiritual, moral and intellectual portion of man's nature. For instance, the spiritual ideas of the ruling powers of the universe entertained by an Oriental sage would be as false a religion for the African savage as the groveling fetishism of the savage would be false for the sage, although both views must necessarily be true in degree, because both represent the highest ideas attainable by the respective individuals of the same cosmico-spiritual facts. We all see the same spirit of truth, but from different points of view. Therefore it is not a difference of religion which separates the races of mankind, but a difference of cyclic evolution, and no man can force his own perceptions of divine truth upon his neighbor without injury to both, neither is there any necessity to compel our fellow men to see as we see, for whosoever is ready to receive a higher, purer, and more practical religion than that which has hitherto satisfied him will be, by natural law, attracted towards those persons who are fitted to supply him with the information he requires, and when he is thus seen to be ready, it is the duty of any Theosophist who has it in his power to teach him, for the fundamental tenet of Theosophy is the brotherhood of man. And now, in conclusion of this discourse, we shall do well to consider the nature of the mischief arising from the adoption of the Mosaic law, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It has already been stated that the Church claims Christianity to be the only true religion, and I do not think any Christian would be prepared to deny that Christ is the head of the Christian Church. Nevertheless, all his altruistic teachings, which so thoroughly pave the way towards brotherhood, have become merely theoretical matter for pulpit oratory, while the precepts of practical selfishness taught in the Mosaic Bible, and against which Christ so vainly preached, have become ingrained into the innermost life of the Western nations. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth has become the first maxim of the law, but Moses made laws to suit the hardness of the hearts of the people, so, also, do we, in our generation. It was not so, however, with the gospel of Christ, which was for all times, and all persons having ears to hear. Christ's precepts on the manner in which we are to treat our enemies, persecutors and slanderers are in direct opposition to the Mosaic teachings. Moreover, he repeatedly tells us, in varied terms, to mind not the teaching of them of old times, meaning Moses and others. He is ever at pains to point the difference between laws made to suit the slowly growing mentality of the physical world and those which were instituted by deity in the beginning. In the 5th chapter of the Gospel of St. Matthew, for instance, we may mark the wide difference between Christ's teaching of the law of divine justice as it existed in the beginning and that which has since been made by man to suit the hardness of our hearts. Christ says, "Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, But whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor, and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you, and persecute you. That ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven, for he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and setteth rain on the just and on the unjust. For if ye love them which love you, what reward have ye? Do not even the publicans the same? And if ye salute your brethren only, what do ye more than others? Do not even the publicans so? Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. Now this is alike the law of deity, otherwise nature, and the gospel of Christ, which the Church, the law and the greater portion of mankind find impossible of application in the physical world because they are ignorant of the nature of the basis from which it springs. And so long as the Orthodox Church draws an arbitrary line between herself and science, and ignores the value of Christian doctrines other than her own, she will remain thus ignorant, and continue to teach for doctrines the commandments of men. For the precept of love your enemies, which Jesus taught, has a purely scientific basis, which, briefly stated, is this: when pure love is sent forth from the subjective mind of man, it manifests as a constructive force having its own particular high yellow rate of vibration. Anger, being an emotion and proceeding from the objective mind, vibrates at a lower rate, which is red. An enemy sends a red current of thought towards you, but if you send loving thoughts in return, you are projecting a yellow rate of vibration, which is infinitely higher and more forceful than the red, and so the yellow deflects the red and it never reaches you. The higher rates of vibration will protect you from harm, and if you live according to ethical principles, you attain a high quality of thought or vibration. Thought is the creative power of life, and the teachings of Christ and the scientific researches of men both show us that thought is vibration. Thought vibration is colored according to its rate being determined by its quality. The higher and purer the thought, the more rapid the rate of vibration, and the paler the yellow shade of color. The higher your thought vibrations are, the greater your power over all that exists in the physical world, from mineral up to man. The action of thought vibration is governed by the great scientific law of attraction and repulsion, whereby the thoughts and emotions of persons of similar colored rates of vibration are attracted towards each other as a magnet draws a needle until they finally mingle and by amalgamation produce larger results. On the other hand, dissimilar rates cannot blend. And so the higher deflects the lower, which means that, wherever anger is met by love, the projector of the angry vibrations, instead of sharing the evil effects of his anger with the person he is angry with, as would have been the case if both had projected angry thoughts, receives the whole of the ill effects himself, because the red current, having been deflected by the yellow one projected by the good person, has no alternative but to return to its sender, and thus a significant sidelight may be cast upon the scientific value of the time-honored adage, curses are like young chickens, they always come home to roost. In cases where both the projector and the receiver of evil thoughts are angry, the red current flows uninterruptedly between the two, each person thereby receiving his just due of evil effects. The good vibrations of a good man's thought blend and swell the current of good, so likewise do the evil vibrations of a bad man's thought blend with the universal evil. But good is a positive force, whereas evil is negative, and though the two forces are absolutely necessary to each other for the purpose of progression in physical life, it is law that the positive shall finally overcome the negative. It is law, moreover, which, although divinely instituted in the beginning, is mechanical in its action and impossible of alteration, as Christ and all other great reformers knew. though the majority of persons are even now as ignorant of its very existence as were the Pharisees when they accused Christ of casting out devils by the power of Beelzebub, the prince of the devils, in other words, of casting out a negative force by the power of its own vibrations, a scientific impossibility as opposed to the law, one jot nor one tittle of which shall pass until all be fulfilled. If the science of good and evil were logically dealt with in the pulpit, sheer, level-headed common sense would lead most persons to see how they were injuring themselves in deceiving their neighbors, and also how, by honorable and pure thought, they attract the honorable thought of others. But we are advancing towards the time when the impossibility of curing evil with evil will be more generally recognized, and the Mosaic law, which is now practiced throughout our so-called civilized countries, will have served its turn in providing us with that wisdom which results from bitter experience. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth has never stamped out crime in any nation, but love has transformed the greatest criminals into holy men. Therefore, as the purpose of physical life is progression towards spiritual wisdom, ripened understanding must result in reorganization of constitutional law. Purity is the keynote to spiritual knowledge, and to all who persistently turn the hearts, otherwise the vibrations, of their enemies, persecutors and slanderers, and overcome evil with good, the conditions of heaven may become manifest on earth.